Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something really cool. We're diving into The Crucible of a Working Life, James Richman in 1835. We're going to take a completely immersive journey back in time to explore this fascinating intersection where everyday microhistory violently collides with the sweeping, world-altering changes of the Industrial Revolution. And the best part? We're going to understand this massive shift by looking at the life of one very specific, very real young man, James Richman.
Let's start with the number 14. Seriously, take a second and think about what being 14 means today. Usually, it's high school, hanging out with friends, maybe getting a part-time job if you're really ambitious. But for James Richman in 1835, 14 was a completely different universe. It wasn't about finding yourself. It was about absolute economic necessity. By the standards of his day, he was pretty much a grown man, and his physical labor every single day was quite literally keeping his family afloat.
To really get James, we have to put ourselves right there in his physical world. So welcome to Hilperton Marsh, Wiltshire. Now don't picture some pristine, perfectly manicured English countryside. Imagine low-lying ground that basically turned into a muddy swamp during the winter. You'd constantly hear the rushing of the nearby River Biss, along with the steady, thumping rhythm of narrowboats slowly chugging down the Kennet and Avon Canal, hauling coal and wool. This wet, muddy, working village was his entire universe.
Right in the middle of all that dampness was his cottage. His whole physical reality was defined by one very specific atmosphere. As they used to say, the smell of wool and damp stone was the smell of home. Imagine sharing just 2, maybe 3 cramped rooms with your parents and 5 siblings. Oh, and it's not just the 8 of you bumping elbows. Massive, heavy hand looms dominated the living space, so it was cramped, it was wet, and it was incredibly loud.
So who exactly is packed into this cottage? The Richman household was bursting at the seams. You've got his parents, John and Anne, and 6 kids ranging from 24-year-old Elizabeth all the way down to 12-year-old Thomas. Meaning, privacy? Yeah, that just absolutely did not exist. Beds were shared, every conversation was public. But here's the crucial takeaway. In a working-class family like this, every single pair of hands was a critical economic asset. They literally had to be, just to survive.
Okay, which brings us to a pretty harsh reality, the end of childhood. Today, we kind of just assume that kids get a protected childhood full of learning and playing. But back in 1835, that was a luxury reserved strictly for the rich. For working-class kids like James, childhood ended fast. Actually, scratch that, it practically vanished. You were expected to be a full-time contributing adult worker by the time you were 12 years old.
You might be wondering, what does a year of relentless farm labor actually look like for a kid? Well, in the spring, a boy his age would be out doing bird scaring. It's exactly what it sounds like, a totally monotonous job keeping rooks and pigeons off the newly planted grain. By summer, you're weeding, hoeing, and tending livestock all day. And autumn brought the back-breaking labor of the harvest and haymaking. But hey, it wasn't all bad. The harvest was deeply communal. Huge gangs of workers moved across the fields together, sharing food, stories, and conversation.
And what about school, right? Did he go? Well, based on parish records, which show his parents signing their own marriage registers with an X, we can confidently guess James couldn't write his own name. But don't let that fool you. He possessed a profoundly practical education. He didn't learn from books, sure, but he had vital, life-sustaining knowledge. He knew how to read the weather, how to manage the soil, how to handle a massive horse and cart, and exactly how to turn raw sheep's fleece into finished cloth. That street smarts, or farm smarts rather, was his education. But here's the catch. All that incredible practical knowledge about wool, it was under severe threat. The villain of our story? Steam-powered factories. James's parents were traditional handloom weavers, but their manual, family-run cottage industry was rapidly dying out. They were being relentlessly squeezed by the massive, booming expansion of steam-powered factories that could pump out cloth for a mere fraction of the cost. Let's bring back that number 14 for a second. Only this time, we're not talking about his age. We're talking about an existential macroeconomic nightmare. By 1820, 15 years before our snapshot, there were already 14 massive steam-powered factories operating just a mile or 2 down the road in Trowbridge. Mechanization was literally knocking on their front door. It drove their wages into the ground and eventually forced James's dad to pivot to the back-breaking work of hauling coal just to keep food on the table.
And as if falling wages weren't terrifying enough, a new nightmare rolls into town, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This piece of legislation replaced the older, neighborly parish relief with a brutal, centralized regime focused on the workhouse. And the most chilling part about it?
It was deliberately designed to be intensely, agonizingly unpleasant, so that only the absolute most desperate people on Earth would ever ask for help. These weren't just abstract political rules. These were stark, terrifying realities hanging over every family in Hilperton Marsh. The message was brutally simple: work or go to the workhouse. Accepting government relief meant regimented misery. It meant husbands and wives were forced apart. It meant the heartbreaking separation of parents from their own children. That threat loomed over every single cough, every illness, every spell of unemployment. And sadly, we know this hit home, because records show John Richman would eventually end up listed as a pauper.
Okay, let's take a breath. I want to release some of that narrative tension, because it wasn't all just grueling labor and impending doom. We're going to pivot to something incredibly vital: community, faith, and fun. Because despite the immense hardships, these working-class communities had an amazingly rich social life. They built incredible resilience together, and they genuinely found profound joy in their daily lives. At the absolute center of all that joy and community was St. Michael's Church. This wasn't just somewhere you went for an hour on Sunday. It was the anchor of their entire existence. It marked every single major life milestone: the baptisms, the weddings, the burials. It completely organized the seasonal rhythms of the year, like the big harvest festivals. It was a shared, sacred space where the whole village gathered, giving them both a spiritual and social backbone.
But outside the church walls, how did a 14-year-old guy actually let off steam? Despite the brutal work hours, we have to remember James was still a teenager. He and his buddies were swimming in the canal, probably driving their parents absolutely crazy, playing cricket on the village greens and knocking down skittles at the local alehouses. They played this incredibly rough, chaotic version of street football and went to see wild animal shows and traveling entertainers at the Trowbridge fairs. He found pleasure wherever he possibly could.
Now imagine those freezing winter evenings in that cramped cottage. It's pitch black outside, the cold is seeping through the walls, and that giant, noisy loom is finally quiet. The cottage would completely fill with traditional Wiltshire folk songs, old ballads and hymns. It was this music, sung shoulder to shoulder with his family, that made the brutal work bearable, and made their rare leisure time feel incredibly sweet and warm. So let's pull back and look at the big picture. This snapshot of James in 1835, dealing with poverty, exhaustion, and rapid industrial change, this was his crucible. It was the intense forge that built the immense resilience he'd rely on for the rest of his life. And you know what? That resilience eventually pointed him toward a completely different horizon, across the Atlantic Ocean. When we map out the timeline of his entire life, the contrast is literally staggering. Born in 1821, working in the mud of Hilperton in 1835, he marries Hannah in 1845. And then, in 1855, he makes the massive, extraordinarily brave leap to uproot his entire family and immigrate to America. This 14-year-old boy from a damp, cramped Wiltshire cottage crosses the ocean and ends up living all the way to 1912, dying at the unbelievable age of 91 in Connecticut. Just what a ride.
Which leaves us with a really provocative question to ponder. How are the foundations of our modern lives built by the quiet, unrecorded resilience of people exactly like James? You know, when we look at history, we almost always focus on the kings, the politicians, or the wealthy inventors. But it's actually the relatable, everyday endurance of working families that built the modern industrialized world we live in today. Look a little closer at the everyday history that built our world. You might even find it in your own family tree. Thanks for joining me on this one. I'll see you next time.